Mr. Chow worked as a NASA engineer from 1966 to 1973 and helped construct many of the lunar modules that defined the space race. He currently serves as the president of the Mississippi Delta Chinese Historical Society, and he has been a leading advocate for the preservation of the Mississippi Chinese history for over 2 decades. Gilroy and his wife Sally have shared their stories and their food with hundreds of visitors. They've been featured in the New York Times, Southern Living, the Washington Post, and the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. So much of the work you're going to hear today has been made possible by Gilroy and Sally's pioneering efforts. So please help me in welcoming Mr. Gilroy Chow.
Thank you for those kind words, Zach. We've heard from scholars and academians. As Zach said, I'm an engineer, but I'm well retired. And so it has been a passion of mine to honor and preserve the history that my parents and their peers did in the Mississippi Delta. And so what we want to do this afternoon is use those stories to see how the museum in Cleveland, Mississippi is doing, just how the museum came to be and what we're doing. As they say, it's a work in process, but as we know, we study history, and then as we continue to grow, we find out that oftentimes we become a part of that history. And so want to make a few comments. That picture on top is the CAPS building at Delta State University. Thanks for having us. As they said, I've worked for a good while in the engineering field and been blessed by that. The museum is a partnership. We're a 501c3. We're partnered with Delta State University and the city of Cleveland. They recognize that the Chinese were a part of their history and are helping us preserve that. Delta State gives us space to house artifacts, oral histories, and the work of the university archivist includes the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum. So I'm not an academic, so this is a picture of my family, my wife, my kids, my in-laws, and what do Delta families do? We farm. That's not our tractor, but it's on our land. The board from the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum, 15 members, and you can just look at some of those places. We're spread across the country, all volunteers, all with the same mission to preserve the history of their parents, ancestors, neighbors. So the Mississippi Chinese, as Zach said, you're from Mississippi? You don't look Mississippian. No, but it goes from Memphis down to Vicksburg, follows the Mississippi River, and we call ourselves the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum because we're inclusive of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. But if you go 40 miles, 50 miles either side of the Mississippi River, you're going to find that Chinese have settled there. As they say, we found anecdotal evidence going back at least 150 years. So as many of the Chinese came to the United States from Toisan, they were sojourners coming to make a living and then to go back home. But some of those sojourners stayed. So 5 years ago, they had the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike. Corky Lee wanted to fix a wrong that when the railroad was joined, a picture was taken. Out of all the people in that picture, there were no Chinese. But Corky said that we're going to fix that, and so he got descendants And so my brother, who was 90 at the time, said that we're going to Utah. And I said, why? He said, our grandfather worked on the railroad. I said, our grandfather, that was 150 years ago. I did the arithmetic, and if grandpa started his family late and daddy started his family late, it was our grandfather. So 5 generations of the Chows went and attended at Promontory Point. And so we are in the picture. And if you look in the New York Times or on CBS TV, you'll see people in red and in gold and in black, and one family in teal. And the teal family is my daughter, my granddaughter, my brother, and his children in that picture, along with the 2 famous railroad trains. But where did the workers go? Well, my grandfather must have been a sojourner because he went back to China to have my dad, who came to the United States much later. But some ended up in the South, and he had to be coming to Mississippi for a reason, because somebody he knew. Because why else would you send a young teenage son off to thousands of miles to a place where he wouldn't know anybody except perhaps a cousin or an uncle? We've heard about 1882, how that excluded, we say excluded, it allowed 105 people from Europe could come in unlimited numbers, but it limited the Chinese to 105. So how did they get here? As merchants, as students, and it was not repealed, and then the regrets were issued in 2014 when I met Ted. So where specifically in the Mississippi Delta? Bolivar County is 75 miles south of Memphis, and that's where my dad came in at the Amistad Center in Tulane. I found records where he came as a teenager and attended school every day for a year before he migrated north to Mississippi, and then he returned. There's a record in that same one of the similar books of the Chinese school in Metairie, of him returning to visit in 1922 with his friend Joe Singh from Cleveland, Mississippi. But the Chinese settled the Mississippi Delta, and I've heard the question asked many times, why Mississippi? And as the other question goes, I wish I had asked that question of him when I had the opportunity. But he didn't talk about his early history. He gave us other values. So again, the museum is located on the 3rd floor of the Capps building, so if you're ever in Mississippi, you'll know where to find us. So we started out as a 501c3, and Delta State University provided us a curator, collections manager, and then that teaches us lay people how to properly archive things and collect oral histories in a proper format, and that has been so helpful to us over the last 20 years. In every town and corner of Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta, and this slide says 1,200, but I think it's closer to 2,500 at the peak period. So the diaspora from Toisan to Mississippi happened 150 years ago, but since the last 50 years, there's been a diaspora out of the Mississippi Delta across this country, and we're going to tell the story of some of those. But there was a grocery store in every town, but the demographics are changing. So what Mississippi Delta towns have now are either closed main streets or main streets with one store. At one time, there were 25 Chinese stores in Clarksdale, perhaps 50 in Greenville, and 2, 3, 4, or 5 in every other small town that had over 100 people. And this is some of the anecdotal evidence, directories from towns like Arcola, Belzona, Biloxi, Ball, Benoit, and Clarksdale. But as a museum, we have collected oral histories and we have outreach. So we have programs. So we participated in Bookstock. From New York City, H.T. Chen Dance Company created the story of the Mississippi Delta Chinese called South of Gold Mountain. They created a ballet, and they actually created excerpts of that this past fall when they revisited Delta State and Cleveland. If you look at the real small people there, that's Tony and Carolyn, who is on our board. They came to the ribbon cutting when we opened the museum. It's people like Tony and Carolyn that helped us get the start and to help us preserve the memory of their parents. If you go to the museum today, you can sit on a park bench that Carolyn has generously donated for visitors to coming through. We'll talk about a little more in a minute. This is the H.T. Chen. We've heard about the Congressional Gold Medal for the Chinese. A lot of it had to start with Gwyn Gong and her husband and daughter writing this book about the Mississippi Delta Chinese veterans in 1999. And there's 2 World War II veterans there. Pat Pang lived to 105, is the oldest living World War II veteran in Mississippi, and that legislation was created by Ed Cochran after he had seen Uncle Pap. We'll get to that slide a little bit later. At a football game in Ole Miss. But then another thing that came out of the museum, Adrian Berard wrote the book Gong Lum versus Rice. This was the legislation that said separate but equal became the law of the land in 1928. Well, that family was from Rosedale, Mississippi, because their children were not allowed to go to school, but it became the law of the land for everybody, not just Chinese, but blacks and whites. They said that separate but equal was okay, but documenting that story, it was Adrian Berard's book, Water Tossing Boulders. So Adrian interned at the museum and then got the idea for the book and subsequently published it. And she did her initial book signing at that state. In 1937, there was a building, the Chinese Mission School, where Chinese were educated, and it was where they had to go to school because they couldn't go to the public schools in Cleveland, Mississippi. Each town was different because in that same year, my mother-in-law was valedictorian of her class in Marks because she was able to go to school in Marks. In Cleveland, we were not, and people came from neighboring towns, and this was actually a boarding school. People lived there. So when the school was torn down, the museum went to work to get a highway marker to commemorate the spot, and then the cornerstone is at the Delta State Museum. And so some of the alumni of that school, the one in front is Kellogg Wong, I.M. Pei architect, who was our keynote speaker for the dedication of the marker, commented, Kellogg said that one of his proudest moments was when they were topping the tallest building in China. And he says, but this was the first opportunity he had to thank his parents for having that store in Rosedale that gave he and his brother the start. And that was a remark I'll never forget. But those were all alumni of the Chinese Mission School. Chinese served, and so Mississippi was well represented among the veterans to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. And they have continued to serve in others, and as early as the Civil War. were the subject of a New York Times photo essay. Chinese participate in sports. Um, so why the museum? So that people can come back and visit. And we have done this on a number of occasions. People come back to visit the museum to look and see with their family. I want to take a slight break and ask my wife Sally to talk about her own experiences so that, as we say, we are giving anecdotal evidence of her family, my family.
Hey, everybody. It is my pleasure and honor to say that I get to talk about my family. And this is my grandfather with his 10 children. Actually, there's not a couple of them have not been born yet when this picture was taken. But Joan Sam came to the United States at the turn of the century, and we don't know why he decided to head toward Marks, Mississippi. But we do know that he came down various states, and each time he stopped, he would find a Chinese family who would let him stay with them, and he would learn a skill. So we know that you see the banners up there. He was a calligrapher. He made those signs. And we know that he also made bread with jalapeno peppers in it. And I think that's unusual for that time of the year. And so this is the family again at a sad event. My grandmother died when the oldest child, my mother, was 16. So with the oldest, Mom became the mother for all of the kids. And so I wanted to say something about Joan Sam. Several years ago, our family was invited to represent the Mississippi Delta at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And so it was going to be 2 weeks. And I thought, wow, what are we going to do for 2 weeks? They want us to tell about our family. And they were kind enough to invite our entire family. And my son Bradley was going to go with us. And so he says, well, gosh, Mom, what is our story? And so this gave us an opportunity to think back and to really dig down into our family history to see how do we end up where we are. And so we talked to our oldest aunt at that time, the elder of the family at that time. Aunt Jean was about 90 at that time. And so she told us most of the story about Joan Sam. And of course, like many Chinese families, we go to the cemetery and we visit our ancestors. And so Bradley says, well, after we had done the festival, he said, now I really understand a little bit more about that man that we always visit at the cemetery. So I say that Joan Sam was the man, because he's the one that started everything for us. He had 10 children, and he delivered all of them. And so we have the children here, and then here is the family, the 10, we call them the 10 siblings. And as a joke, we have, when someone new comes to our family, we tell them, well, you have to be able to name the 10 Pang siblings in chronological order before you can get in the family. So here they are again. And again, all of them, some of them moved out to California. A few of us stayed in the Mississippi Delta. And we talked about education in Mississippi, and at this time how things were segregated. And so it really depended on where you lived and the town that you were in. So my grandfather, Joan Sam, had a grocery store. He also grew Chinese vegetables to be sent to Chicago on a train, and enough that, enough that there was a man who made a living out of putting the vegetables on the train, and that's a lot of vegetables. At that time, they also wanted my grandfather to be the mayor of Marks. And he said, well, I really don't have the time because I have so many children to care for. But what he has done was just amazing. We just think he was amazing to do what he did. My mother was the oldest of the 10. And as I said about education, it really depended on where you lived and what the community wanted to do. So when the Pang children became old enough for school, they had a special meeting at the courthouse and said, well, Pang, I'm sorry, but your children can't go to the school because they're Chinese. And so another leader of the community said, well, I don't understand because his children play with my children. How come they can't go to school together? And so they had a special meeting and the Pang children were allowed to go to the school at Marks, Mississippi. And in 1928, my mother graduated as valedictorian. 1928. So we all grew up in the grocery store. Gilroy mentioned 25 in Clarksville of a population of 20,000. There were Chinese grocery stores on every corner. And so because of their sacrifices that they made for our children and our future children, that we think that it's amazing that we're able to have what we have because of the legacy they have left. And you saw a picture of us earlier on the tractor. Well, this tractor picture is, this is our family. And Gilroy said, this is not our tractor, but it is our land. I know that my mom purchased the land in the 50s. And, many times the Chinese lived at the back of the grocery stores because you could not buy land. But Mom was able to purchase that farm. And later on in years, we found out, we didn't realize it was always the family farm, that the farm was in my dad's name. And so we always wondered, how come Mom had it in Dad's name and not their name together or whatever? But then we realized my dad was an immigrant. So she wanted to make sure that his name was on property, that he was a landowner. But we are just really proud of what they have done. And this is what our opportunity to share, honor our family of what we do. And this is what we do. This is how we're able to do this and give back through our museum. And that's why it is so important to talk and, with your older members of the family and find out what is your story. And so that is ours, that we lived at the back of the store, but we were able to be successful. Our parents always wanted us to have more than they did. And of course, our desire is for our children to have more than they have.
Yeah, so that was Sally's side of the family. Come to find out in later years, that was the farmhouse I was born on in Cleveland, Mississippi. My dad, his brother, and my cousin. And so there were 6 of us. And the Congressional Gold Medal, Dad Cochran was at the football game that Uncle Pap was recognized as the hometown hero at age 100. So there are his 4 nieces and nephews, Sally and her siblings. We've been visited by Andrew Zimmern on the Blues Trail, so you can see Chinese Delta cooking there. NPR has been to the Delta, Melissa Block. Maya Lin with us as a notable chef, because we were hometown cooks. 50 years later, this is what Tom Hanks will look like. In 20 years, that's Jim Lovell and myself with another. What do Chinese in Mississippi do in 2024? They are probably 500 in the Mississippi Delta. Doctors, lawyers, grocers, businessmen in government, engineers, librarians. So they do what everybody else does and then some, but they all give back to their community, and it's because of what they learned from their parents and their peers. So thank you for having us, and if you got any questions about the Mississippi Delta, ask Sally.
Thank you so much, Gilroy. So to move things right along, our next speaker is Miss Emmy Dunn. She's an independent historical researcher and a co-founder of the Chinese Historical Society of Memphis, and the Mid-South. She was born in Cleveland, Mississippi. Emmy moved to Memphis in 1960. She has extensively researched the laundries, restaurants, and grocery stores of the Memphis Chinese community and has conducted additional research on the genealogies of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Memphis families. If you've been able to see the film Far East, Deep South about the Mississippi Delta Chinese community, she is featured in that film both because she helped producer Baldwin Chu find his family store and because her family actually bought Baldwin's family store. Through her work with the Chinese Historical Society of Memphis in the Mid-South, she's established 2 historical markers commemorating the first Lung Gong Tin Yi Association in Memphis and the Chop Suey Cafe on Beale Street. She's the first Chinese to be appointed to the Shelby County Historical Commission, and she works with me as a member of the steering committee of the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project. So please welcome my Chinese history teacher, Emmy Dunn. Just do that left to right. Yeah,
All right, good morning. No, it's good afternoon. Let's wake up. Okay, so I want to thank the 1882 Foundation. Sorry, you can hear me now? Yeah, my thanks to the 1882 Foundation and to the Utah State Historic Preservation Office for inviting me to present my findings on the Chinese history in Memphis. So my sources for this research centers around Ancestry.com, Memphis City Directories, Chronicling America, local newspapers, and interviews. So how do you find a history of the Chinese community that left no diaries, no written materials? In looking for this history, I found very little at the Memphis City Library in their archives department. And it was very disappointing for them to present to me 2 small manila folders with newspaper articles. And I thought there should be more than this, because I felt that the Chinese had been in Memphis for a long time. And at that moment, I decided to find this history. So when I began my research, I realized that I needed names. And what better place to find names than at a cemetery? This is the Chinese section at Amwood Cemetery, a historical cemetery. And I went out there and photographed every headstone and developed my database from the names. So I ran some of the names through Ancestry.com. I was only successful with a couple of the names, so I needed to find another source to find more Chinese names. And that source was the Memphis City Directories. So it happened to be online, which was convenient for me to stay at home and to research the directories. So the problem was to find the year. So I just picked the year, for example, 1880, and I worked backwards until I could not find any more Chinese names, and I searched through all 3 sections. So it's the alpha section, the street name, and the business sections. And in doing that, from the business sections, I was able to develop the laundries, the restaurants, and the grocery stores. So when I got to the year, was 1874. And I thought, that's about right, 1874. But I was also using another source called Chronicling America. And this laundry ad popped up, 1873. I was stunned, but pleased with this evidence at the beginning of a Chinese community. So you have to remember at that time there were a lot of Chinese transits up and down the Mississippi River. But the fact that this laundryman decided to settle gives evidence of the beginning of a Chinese community. So throughout that summer, other Chinese laundrymen placed ads. So in the South, the first business to open were usually laundries, followed by restaurants and grocery stores. They all existed at the same time, but together, but in different time periods. So when the early Chinese arrived in the South to work on plantations in Arkansas in 1869, Mississippi, and Louisiana, they were also coming to build railroads in Texas and Mississippi and Alabama, but working on the plantations was not really to their liking. My theory is that they wanted to make more money, which was the main reason for coming to America. So they saw a way to start businesses, to be entrepreneurs, to make their dream come true, to earn more money to send home, and eventually go home themselves. So starting a laundry didn't require large amounts of capital. And sometimes it was better to have a partner to share the work. Another factor was that you didn't have to hire additional help. And you didn't need a large place. Although the laundryman could get by with very little English, it was important to not be in competition with the whites. So since the laundrymen left no diaries, we rely on local newspapers. And because in that early times, the local newspapers had a heyday writing about these Chinamen. And they described the Chinese in racist terms, but at the same time, they were praised their superb laundry work. But what is more interesting to note is what they left out. And that was the bachelor life of these laundrymen. As we know, there were very, very few women in the U.S. at that time. In Memphis, there was one Chinese woman in 1888. The bachelor suffered long separation from his family. Maybe he would visit his family every 5 years if he had the money, or if he could afford the trip. Although he would be sending money home, as every Chinese person was doing, the daily life revolved around his laundry 6 days a week with 1 day off. There was 1 day off gave him some relief from his loneliness by the company of his bachelor friends, perhaps in a tea shop, writing letters home, cooking a good Chinese meal, reminiscing about home and family, and perhaps some gambling. So who was the last laundryman? We know that Chinese laundries phased out around 1940s due to automation. This Chinese laundryman began in 1940s. He continued until about 1974. His name is Ju Lei, also known as Jim Lum, born in 1910, died in 1988. He is considered the last laundryman of Memphis. He was in the laundry business for about 27 years, in addition to 10 years as a cook in his own restaurant at the same time of his laundry business. His hand laundry gradually adopted automation using steam, which caused an explosion in his laundry. But he recovered from that and continued his laundry. So one day, I was having lunch with a friend and his family, and this friend invited his longtime friend Gary Jewell. So Gary Jewell was talking about this person, Jewel. And the more he talked, the more I realized he was talking about this last laundryman. So it was just pure luck that I met Gary Jewell, because it would have been very difficult to track Gary since his last name was changed to Jewell when it should have been Jude. So fortunately, Gary loved to talk, and he sat for an interview. So we know, so laundries were established in 1873, and then restaurants. So Lee Waugh is credited with establishing the first restaurant in Memphis in 1894. There is not much known about Lee Waugh. If you have done Answer.com or Census, you will know there are thousands of Lee Waugh or Waugh Lee or Sam Waugh. So it's practically impossible to track them. But in 1914, more restaurants started to appear in Memphis, such as Shanghai Cafe. It closed around 1940. There were several investors. Chinese at that time did not go to banks to borrow money. So you had any number of investors. But the principal investor of the Shanghai Cafe was Wong Kok. Wong Kok was a community leader, well respected in the Chinese community. His downfall came in 1937. He was convicted of an opium charge, the federal offense, sentenced to a federal prison for 10 years, fined $10,000, and deported after he was released. Another well-known restaurant is the Mandarin Inn. It opened in 1931 and closed in 1945. Again, there were several investors, including Wong Kok, Lam Soon, and Wong Gip. Mandarin Inn was very innovative. It was not located in downtown Memphis, as most Chinese businesses were at that time, but it was about 10 miles from downtown in what we called Midtown. And the local newspaper raved about this Mandarin Inn because of its popular dance floor and the black band that got Wong Kok in trouble because he allowed the band to play very late into the night. So the reputation of this restaurant was well known throughout the South for its Chinese cuisine and American dishes. So Lam Soon, in the picture there, was a very ardent supporter of the Memphis, of the China Relief Fund for the Mid-South. So as you know, the China Relief Fund started in the Second Sino-Japanese War. And Lam Soon would campaign for donations in the South, going down to Mississippi after he closed the restaurant. And on one such trip, he fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. So he left a pregnant wife and a toddler. The newspaper eulogy described Lam Soon as a patriot who gave his all until it really hurt. And descendants there in this picture, is this the pointer?
I think so. The
Red dot.
Yeah.
The one in the middle. That was the unborn son that never knew his father. So his name is Ed Soon. So he came with his 2 sons and daughter, his wife, and his grandchildren. They live in California. So I found it very moving that Ed Soon thought so much about the Delta, the South, that he would bring his family and grandchildren to see his roots. So they traveled to, after the Lamson died, the mother remarried, moved to Terrell, Arkansas, eventually to Greenville, where there was a terrible tragedy. And then the mother and the sons eventually moved to California, where Ed lives now. Okay, so Jack Wall. 5 minutes? Oh, all right. Jack Wall represents another milestone in the restaurant industry. He did not like the chop suey decor, so his idea of a restaurant was very elegant. He had white tablecloths, flowers on the table, grass cloth wallpaper. He had a curved bridge through the Moon Gate entrance. He wanted a very quiet ambiance for his patrons, so that he put the dishwasher in the furthest corner of his kitchen. One of his innovations was a automatic water sprinkler in the attic to grow his bean sprouts. Remember that you could not just run out to Walmart to get your groceries at that time, especially Chinese goods. With his sons, Jack Long opened the first Chinese fast food with drive-through window. Okay, something quick on Beale Street. This was Beale Street in 1873. If you hear of Beale Street now, you think of blues music, but very few people knew that there were Chinese businesses on Beale Street. There was grocery stores, laundries, a tea shop, and there is now a historical marker that we put there to commemorate the Chinese businesses, and Chop Suey Cafe, which was open for at least 50 years. And also I want to mention Willie Wise, Willie's Cafe, which is Willie Wise, who came from Rosedale, and one of his descendants is in the room today. And there are many descendants actually throughout the South and as far away as New Mexico. Okay, grocery stores I want to mention. The first one started in the 1880s by Ah Wah, who died in 1917. So just to show you what happened on Beale Street, one of the grocery stores, there was a robbery. Joe Tong and his father operated the store. So 2 men came in, demanded money. So Joe Tong reached for the cash box, which was under the counter, and the assailant immediately shot him in the chest. So he died later at the hospital, but he was buried, but then his body was removed and sent back to China. This man, Zhou Tichu, was the last Chinese business to leave Beale Street. He went to this store, 755 Williams. It's in a black neighborhood. So this particular store had been in business since 1938, and my family owned that store after Zhou Tichu, and they retired around 1984. So that particular location was in Chinese-owned hands for about 46 years. Okay, beginning of families. The first Chinese baby to be born in Memphis was in June 1888. His parents owned a laundry on Beale Street. Then we had a couple other Chinese babies to be born, and the first Chinese twins to be born in Memphis. From the Chu Hao family. Soon after they were born, the father died. So this family had, I don't know, close to 10 children. I don't remember exactly. But the Chu Hao family is still very much a part of the Arkansas, Mississippi, and Memphis Chinese community. Just want to run through some notable people. Charles Jin, the first Chinese architect. He was the first one to be buried in a white cemetery, and that took some doing because his wife was a white socialite, and so she paved the way for Chinese to be buried in a white cemetery. So Francis Ma was a well-known architect in Memphis. Here are a couple of his buildings that he designed. Ling Hong Lee was a merit scholar. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Rose College in physics. He earned a medical degree at Baylor University, did postgraduate studies at Mayo Clinic. He was one of the first to invent the biopsy needle. He not only did he do that, he was an inventor. He learned to write his own application for patents, and he also learned enough electricity, or he learned enough to pass the electrician's exam to wire his own house. The last person I want to talk about is May Kim Jo. She came over because of under the War Brides Act. She and her husband had grocery store business, but they were firebombed in 1968. Remember Martin Luther King, 1968. So they got out of the grocery store business and went to the restaurant business. But after her husband died, she is the first Chinese woman to be named by the Memphis JCs as Boss of the Year. She is also the first Chinese woman to be made an honorary Shelby County Commissioner and City Councilman to receive the key to the city of Memphis. So there were several organizations like the Lungon Tinyi. They used this book to teach about Social Security. This is the MSCA, the Mid-South Chinese Community Center. They had different activities for their community members. We also had the first Chinese Baptist Church, and then some current organization, the Chinese Community Center for Seniors, JAMUCA, the Greater Memphis United Chinese Association, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and then in 2016, I was the co-founder of the Memphis Chinese Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South. As Zach mentioned, we installed 2 historical markers. But in conclusion, what I would like to say is that finding this history of the Chinese, Memphis Chinese, gives voice to our Cantonese ancestors to sacrifice and pave the way for us today. We want to honor them by continuing to find and preserve their voices through the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project. Zach and I are both working on that. the Chinese Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South, and the Chinese Heritage Museum under Gilroy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. I definitely want to echo Amy's thanks to Ted for helping to organize this event and Barbara. And I want to do an additional thank you to Amy for helping run all the tech. I really appreciate it. I realized that in my excitement to welcome everyone to our panel and to introduce my speakers, I neglected to introduce myself. So hi, my name is Zach Smith. I'm an associate professor in the history department at the University of Central Arkansas, where I also direct our interdisciplinary Asian Studies program. I realized that in some ways my lack of introduction of myself might have been a self-conscious decision, because I should admit to feeling like a bit of an imposter still in this space. I was actually trained as a cultural historian of modern China. I did my dissertation research in Nanjing and Shanghai. And it's only recently that I've had the enormously wonderful opportunity to sort of participate in a lot of this work. And in a lot of ways, this work I'm going to be talking about today, the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project, began just a little over a year ago when I attended a Lunar New Year banquet that was put on by UCA Center for Chinese Language and Culture. And I had the life-changing good fortune to be seated at a table next to Mr. Ping Fong Jr. He was a retired medical devices professional living in Conway. And he started telling me about his experience growing up in the small Arkansas town of Hughes, where his father owned a cash grocery store, predominantly serving the Black community in the otherwise deeply segregated town of Hughes. And I very swiftly learned that his store was not an anomaly. Indeed, it was one of many stores owned by Chinese, mostly in Black communities, throughout the rural towns of the Mississippi and Arkansas River deltas. Much of this history that you've now heard from Gilroy and Emmy, and so I won't repeat it here, other than to say that it really is hard to overstate how important these grocery stores were to the functioning of these rural towns. In many instances, Chinese-owned grocery stores were the only grocery stores accessible to Black farm workers who faced Jim Crow segregation elsewhere. They were oftentimes the only stores that offered goods on credit to Black farm workers living in deeply exploitative conditions. And as you'll soon discover, these grocery stores are oftentimes so much more than stores. They're community spaces for farm workers. They are sites for the launching of new businesses. And of course, they're a crucial means of livelihood by which a generation of second and third generation Chinese Americans supported their families and paved the way for subsequent generations to pursue oftentimes higher education and professional degrees. You can see from this map from Dr. Xiaolu Yu, who's at Rhodes College in Memphis, just how prevalent Chinese grocery stores were in the sort of area of the Mississippi Delta, and you can see the Arkansas River Delta branching off from there. At one time, there were over 150 Chinese-owned grocery stores in the Delta, and like Gilroy said, many times you would have a grocery store on every corner, especially in towns like Helena, West Helena, in Arkansas, and Pine Bluff. However, it's important to realize that this is a vanishing history. At this point, of those 150 grocery stores, there are only 2 that are still open and in operation today. Many of these stores have closed simply because the populations of these rural towns have declined. Others have faced competition, first, from your Safeways, then from your Dollar Generals. Other times they've closed simply because that subsequent generation has left the state following larger patterns of out-migration for a lot of folks who achieve professional degrees in Arkansas. And so in some cases, the buildings that once housed these stores are still present, but increasingly the buildings are no longer available. And many of those in kind of second and third generation Chinese Americans who grew up in the stores are now in their 80s and 90s. And so we realized very quickly that work needed to be done to preserve this history. So Ping invited me to a tri-state meetup of the Chinese Association of Arkansas, the Chinese Historical Society of Memphis in the Mid-South, and the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Society. And that's where I first met Emmy and Gilroy. And through that meeting, we began conversations to establish what we now call the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project. This is a formal partnership between the University of Central Arkansas Center for Chinese Language and Culture and the Chinese Association of Arkansas to collect, preserve, and showcase the rich history of Chinese Americans in our state. Our goal is to create a multidisciplinary digital oral history archive to share this history not only with members of the Chinese community, but members of the broader public, to educate them about the rich diversity of our state, and to do so very crucially in partnership with other community organizations. Our steering committee consists of both faculty members at UCA as well as community historians like Imi, Ping Fong, who I mentioned, and his wife Lucy, and others. And I want to emphasize from the start that this has really been a community-based project. When it comes to the history of Chinese communities in the South, it has not been universities and academic institutions that have led the way. It has been Chinese historical societies and community researchers. And so we really want to follow in their footsteps and provide a platform for the enormous amount of work that's been done to preserve this history already. We also want to create a project that is multidisciplinary and broadly accessible. We started recording oral history interviews just last summer. Our first interview actually was with Miss Susie Tonyman, who herself was 95 at the time that we recorded that interview. We've since recorded about 12 more, totaling about 20 hours of oral history with over 100 digitized photographs. Our immediate goals are first to create, as I said, a digital oral history archive and resource center. There are actually Chinese Arkansans whose stories and artifacts are well represented at the Mississippi Delta Chinese Historical Museum in Cleveland. Increasingly, though, we've talked to family members whose, their children live out of state, and we want to create a resource that's going to be accessible to everyone, no matter where you live in the world. We also want to create classroom resources for middle, high school, and undergraduate educators. We really want to change the way that Arkansas history is taught. One of the other hats that I wear, I'm the statewide Arkansas director for the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia. We work to empower K-12 teachers to center Asian and Asian American history in their classrooms. And we want to create curricular resources that allow Arkansas history classes to do more to tell the story of Chinese grocers. And then we want to also organize public exhibits and collaborative workshops, much like this one, to kind of keep this conversation going and keep those kind of communication networks between community organizations and universities open. Before I talk about some of the initial insights that we've gained from the oral history interviews, I also want to make one other plug about how engaging in this kind of community work can really be transformative for university classrooms and for Asian studies programs. I've already had a couple conversations with folks here that for whatever reason, there's in the past been somewhat of a divide between Asian studies and Asian American studies. And my experience in the very recent past has shown that there is enormous benefit to Asian studies programs, to more deeply engaging Asian American, and Pacific Islander history. So in spring 2024, I had the privilege of teaching a brand new class at UCA on Asian American history in the South. It was designed as a critical service learning course in which UCA students could fulfill course objectives, get a broad sort of background in Asian American history, but also gain practical hands-on experience working with community co-educators to build the foundations of what would become our digital oral history archives. If you're familiar with service learning, it's a widely celebrated kind of high-impact practice that really helps student success and retention. But in the past, sometimes it's been framed as this effort to kind of, well, the university is going to use college students to help the community in need. And really the approach of this project was to actually recognize the expertise of community co-educators and work with community members to sort of tell shared stories about our own communities. We wanted to create the foundations of this digital oral history archive and create really a space of representational belonging for Chinese Americans in the South. I should say when I first pitched this class, my chair was a little bit skeptical. We have never taught any Asian American history classes at UCA before. But this ended up being the most popular class of spring 2024. It immediately hit its enrollment cap. Students were really excited. So as part of the class, we actually took students down to the Delta. So UCA, I should say, is located in Conway, which is basically a suburb of Little Rock. So we drove down to the Delta. We actually met with Mayor Jeff Al-Young, who's the current mayor of McGee, Arkansas. They also visited the World War II Japanese American Internment Museum there. We traveled to the historic Chinese Cemetery in Greenville, where Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum board member Frida Kwan met with our students and talked to them. And then, of course, we visited the museum. And again, from the images from Gilroy's presentation from me, if you have not made it to Cleveland yet, I guarantee you this is a truly transformative experience, and there is no better way to understand the history of Mississippi Delta Chinese communities than to go to that museum. We were also fortunate to welcome community historians into our classroom. So Imi kindly shared some of her time with our students, teaching them how to use tools like Ancestry.com and genealogical research to flesh out their studies. And then some of our interviewees, like Lucy Zhou Fong, came to visit our classroom to work with students to develop metadata for archiving her own family's history. So you can see, let's see if I'm good at the pointer. That's her there, and then that's her there sort of working with our students. And then this past April, we were able to actually host a small workshop on Chinese Americans' histories in the South where my students presented alongside community presenters like Emmy and academics like Dr. Melody Lee, you see here, to kind of talk about ongoing efforts to preserve this history. And it was so fantastic to see conversations between students and community members. This group of students, their project was about higher education for Chinese Americans in Arkansas. And they found out that one of our interviewees, Beverly, was an alumna of UCA. So they went into the UCA archives and found her old yearbook photos. And she was very excited to see those. And so it's been a truly fantastic and transformative experience. And so if there's anyone here who's based in an academic institution teaching courses, I would love to talk to you about other ways in which you've worked to incorporate Asian American history into your curriculum, because I still have a lot to learn myself. With the time left, I want to share some of the kind of initial insights that we've gained from this oral history project. Again, we've only been at it for a year. I can't claim anything definitive, but I want to share some sort of emergent themes. And the big case I would make about why this history is important is that, I think a lot of Asian American history remains really focused on urban Chinatowns on the East and West Coast. And I think that these stories give us an opportunity to kind of think outside of that context. But also in terms of Southern history, which is so often presented just in terms of black and white, these stories really sort of complicate a lot of the normal narratives or the standard narratives that are told about the South. So just to share a couple of quick themes. So a major one is civic engagement. Chinese Americans have been heavily involved in civic activities in Arkansas for many, many years. Actually, in 1927, Arkansas became the very first state in the nation to overturn an alien land law following a challenge from a prominent real estate broker of Elaine, Arkansas, Lum Jung Luke. I should say this is not because Arkansans were especially enlightened at this time, but rather because the Arkansas State Constitution takes a very liberal view towards private property rights. Later on, you saw the establishment of civic organizations like the Arkansas Chinese Merchants Association. So in our interview with Susie, she said, we formed in the 1930s not only for social purposes, but if someone got into trouble, if they got run out of town, they would support that person. My father, her father, Ju Chong, was the first president of what later would become the Chinese Association of Arkansas. It was founded in 1943, partially to advocate on behalf of Chinese merchants, but also to promote the war effort. And there was real reason to establish this organization in 1943 because following the establishment of the two Japanese internment camps in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome, there emerged a concern from Arkansas farmers that after the war was over, Japanese Americans would stay and outcompete them. And so the current governor of Arkansas at the time, who was a KKK member, tried to revive the alien land law to target Japanese Americans currently interned in Rower and Jerome. And actually, through the activism of the Chinese Association of Arkansas, working in partnership with white community leaders, they were able to stop that law from being passed and to protect the property rights of Chinese merchants. We also see sort of everyday forms of civic engagement. There's a surprising number of Chinese American mayors in Arkansas. Charlie Waugh of Turrell, Arkansas in the 1970s. We already mentioned the Chu Howe family. William Chu Howe was the mayor of Crawfordsville, Arkansas from 1976 all the way until 1993. This is not due to large amounts of support from the local Chinatown. In fact, the Chu Howe family was the only Chinese family in Crawfordsville, and yet he was elected mayor. In an interview with his son, he also mentioned, their store, growing up in the small town of Eastern Arkansas, our store was the daytime number to report a fire. So as the siren would go off, firemen would drive by the store and we'd yell at them whose house was on fire. So it's this kind of everyday, really central to the community. Another theme that we see is entrepreneurship, right? Chinese-owned businesses date back a very long time in Arkansas. The earliest records we have of a Chinese laundry opened in Little Rock in 1974. And in fact, this map of downtown Little Rock from 1886 shows the location of a Chinese laundry at the corner of 3rd and Scott Street, which is now actually the site of the historic Arkansas Museum. Other just everyday kind of conversations and interviews, many interviewees noted, in Helena, West Helena, families had to work so hard for their living. My dad said, if you don't work hard today and make a go of it, you might not have a good tomorrow. So you have to work hard every day. He was a hard taskmaster because he expected us to come home from school every day to work in the store. And so many of the stories were about, basically it's you go to school, you come home and you work in the store, oftentimes very late on Friday and Saturday night until midnight or so. It's an extremely difficult amount of work that goes into it. We also see a kind of entrepreneurial spirit in terms of the new businesses that are launched. Beverly Go Wasson of Pine Bluff mentioned, my daddy really expanded for a guy who didn't finish high school. He learned to be a photographer. So he had a small photography business and he kind of catered to the black neighborhood because we were kind of in a black neighborhood. So I still have people walk up to me and say, I still have that picture your daddy did. He took photography. He later got a license to do radio and TV repair. He opened up an egg roll stand in the store. I should say that the sort of economic fortunes of Chinese grocers were sometimes uncertain, and there were not always entirely frictionless relationships between Chinese and black communities. In the aftermath of the MLK assassination, like Emmy mentioned, there were actually widespread boycotts that were organized first against white-owned grocery stores. So this flyer actually comes from a boycott against a white-owned grocery store, Ernest Ray's Grocery in Blytheville. But many Chinese Americans found that their grocery stores were also targets of boycotts. Frank Joe mentioned that in Helena, essentially all of the businesses, even across the track, were done. They lost their businesses, they lost the customers, and then they lost the receipts of the customers who had credit balances. And so when the boycott happened, that essentially meant that the entire Asian community on both sides no longer exist. A couple of other just quick themes is really diverse efforts to preserve kind of culture and community. So one big theme is sort of preservation of language. Although there was, of course, the Mission Chinese School in Mississippi, and there were some local efforts to establish Chinese schools, I should say that actually many families moved to Arkansas from Mississippi because in most cases in Arkansas, Chinese families could send their children to otherwise whites-only public schools. But that created real barriers for sort of retaining language. I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but Lucy shared with me a handwritten notebook where she essentially came up with her own romanization system to try to record the Chinese sayings of her mother. Susie mentioned, her husband Daniel Tonyman's father, Robert, taught Daniel Chinese through about the 4th grade, and they spoke Chinese fluently, but Daniel's father was often called upon when there would be a banquet, or like the Arkansas Merchants Association, and he would be called on to recite some poetry. He was one of the only Chinese in the community who knew classical Chinese and could recite poetry. Food also, of course, we've already seen in the case of Gilroy and Sally's family. Joanne Lee Sing, whose father was Chinese and his mother was white, noted that every Sunday we had Chinese food with my grandparents. Sunday was Chinese food. Mom and Dad made everything from scratch. There were at this time no Chinese restaurants. It was hard to locate ingredients. And it was the one Chinese tradition we had early on. We all used chopsticks except for my white grandparents. And there's just some other emergent themes as well. This theme of kind of mobility. Again, because there were not centralized Chinatowns, many families ended up moving around quite frequently. A lot of families were severely impacted by a tuberculosis diagnosis, where one parent was sent to a sanatorium and they had to relocate to it, sometimes as far away as Houston, Texas, before returning.